Welcome to Asset Management Program Overview Training. This training is about the design and functionality of the Asset Management Program. The topics covered in this presentation are Asset Management Program, or AMP, Framework Overview, Management Systems Overview, Functions Overview, Implementation Mechanisms Overview, and finally, Roadmap Overview. Asset Management Program Framework Design. What you're looking at is a representation of an asset management program in its entirety. It's called the Asset Management Program, or AMP, framework, and it will serve as our map and reference as we explore the organization and functionality of the program. The framework is a representation of all the parts and pieces of an asset management program and how those parts and pieces are organized. Later in this course, we're going to discuss the framework structure in more detail, but the idea to take away at the moment is that the program consists of 6 areas of practice called management systems. These are governance, lifecycle, reliability, spare part, work, and calibration. Each management system contains 4 focus areas called functions, and each function is enabled by 4 implementation mechanisms, which are the processes. There are 4 processes associated with each function, the people, the data, and sustainability necessary to execute and preserve the functions. And you'll notice I said there were 4 processes associated with each function, 24 functions in the program, so there's 96 processes that make up the entire asset management program. Because each management system can be broken down into functions, and each function contains specific processes, the functions can be organized in order of implementation as illustrated in the roadmap section of the slide. The roadmap is a general representation of when each function occurs in time if starting to develop a program from scratch, from the time we obtain leadership support to the time we dispose of the asset. We'll talk more about the roadmap later as well. The point of all this granularity is that without an organizational structure like this that identifies every small thing that happens within the AMP, things are going to get missed, or perhaps they'll get done in several different ways at different standards of quality and content. This is why wheels come off on many attempts to create and sustain an effective asset management program, because there's no framework to build it by, no plan. But by ensuring that process is well defined in terms of what needs to be done, who is responsible for doing each task, the data necessary to support execution, and the actions necessary to support and sustain each process, the entire asset management program can be built and operated smoothly and effectively. The identification and organization of the AMP framework makes all the difference between success and failure of the program. Asset Management Program Management Systems. Development of the management systems used in the AMP framework was based on several inputs. ISO 55000, which is the international standard that covers management of assets of any type, practitioner experience, Society for Maintenance and Reliability Professionals, SMRP, guidance, International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers, ISPE guidance, and other proven bodies of knowledge. The management systems are the main areas of practice involved with asset management. Governance guides how the asset management program is designed and administered, and provides guidance on organizational readiness for asset management implementation. Lifecycle guides the activities related to acquiring, commissioning, operating, and disposing of assets. Reliability guides the philosophy of risk management and focusing resources on things that are important to the business. Spare parts guides materials and parts management to support the asset management program. Work guides how asset care needs are identified, planned, scheduled, and executed. And calibration guides how calibration programs are developed and administered to ensure compliance and protect product quality. So essentially, everything that needs to happen to manage assets in compliance with the source inputs is contained in the management systems. This particular topic about the framework is focused on the management systems. Notice how the management systems are generally defined by job function. Governance is related to program definition, management, and control. So it's of most interest to the management staff who will be responsible for the overall program. Lifecycle focuses on procurement, condition monitoring, disposal of assets. So it's of interest to people like in finance and engineering. Reliability, spare parts, and work are of interest to the personnel who care for the assets directly, as is calibration. So I hope that instead of appearing complicated, the AMP framework provides you with some reassurance that the asset management program is manageable because it's organized. Management systems represent the major divisions of responsibility within the asset management program. Think of them as the who of the asset management program. These divisions provide general identification of the functional elements that are necessary to develop, implement, and sustain the asset management program. Organizing the AMP into management systems provides the means to group the functions by the type of support that each one provides to the AMP. Now remember, the management system contains 4 sequential functions for a total of 24 functions in the AMP. This is a closer look at the AMP management systems to show the functions that make up each one. Governance is about the organization's ability to support the effects of AMP implementation and ensure that the necessary processes can be built, incorporated, and aligned with asset management best practices. Lifecycle addresses the actions performed during each phase of asset life, from the time an asset is acquired to the time that it is disposed of. Reliability encompasses the processes that focus the organization's asset management resources on risk in terms of what's important to the organization's mission and what can threaten that mission. Spare part serves to ensure the parts and materials necessary to support asset care are identified and available, again focused on risk expressed as criticality to the business. Work management covers the functions that serve to create and sustain a non-reactive approach to asset care activities and increase effectiveness and efficiency of asset care strategies. Finally, calibration is comprised of the functions that create a compliant, risk-based instrument care program. Notice how the management systems generally align with existing job functions in a typical organization. So now it's easier to see who is going to be taking care of what functions. Each management system is comprised of 4 functions listed in order of implementation. So there are 24 functions total in the program, and each function contains 4 processes that make the function work. So all in all, there are 96 processes in the whole asset management program. These 96 processes that, if they are correctly built, implemented, and supported in terms of people, data, and sustainability, they ensure that asset management will be world-class and aligned with best practices. Next, let's take a deeper dive into the framework by looking at the AMP framework functions. AMP functions are the method that's used to group and organize sequential processes within a management system. Grouping these processes together that share similar input and outputs allows us precise control of the management system execution, and it gives us a means to accurately adjust processes for continuous improvement of the asset management program. Function design. Let's continue the exploration of the AMP framework by focusing on functions for a minute. I do want to leave you with a sense of why functions are constructed like they are and how the processes within a function interact. As an example, let's look at the reliability management system. The 4 functions associated with the RE management system are asset identification, failure mode identification, proactive task identification, and spare part identification. The 4 processes associated with the asset identification function, function number 1 in the reliability management system, are asset decision matrix. That's where we apply rules to decide what is an asset. Asset organization, where we create the physical and functional relationships, and then we develop rules for grouping the assets functionally. Asset data documentation, creating asset records that are accurate and complete. And then asset prioritization, establishing the relative importance of each asset to the business. So this is the first thing, these 4 processes are the first thing that happens in the RE management system in asset identification. That's a function. This function is supported by the 4 processes that first require rules to be established for defining the asset, then to organize the asset, making sure that all the assets are accurately and completely documented, and then finally ranking the assets based on importance to the business. Each of the processes is documented under a procedure or a guideline, so the process remains consistent in execution and output to the overall asset management program. All the asset management systems and functions and processes work like this to support the asset management program. Functions are implemented in order, as are the processes within each function. The position of each function in the overall asset management program implementation path is illustrated by the roadmap at the bottom of the slide. Well, let's keep digging. We've gotten management systems and functions described, so let's talk about the implementation mechanisms that are associated with each and every function. The next thing to talk about after management systems and functions, like we said, are the implementation mechanisms. Now, we touched on these several times when we were discussing the process, people, and data and sustainability, but these next couple of slides give you a little bit more detail. Every function, like we said, has 4 processes associated with it that are executed in sequence to implement that function. Then the people represent who is responsible for executing the function processes. Data represents the information that's used when executing the function processes, and sustainability represents the idea that every function process must be monitored and evaluated to maintain the function process. By ensuring that each mechanism is intact and functional, we can ensure successful implementation and execution of the entire asset management program, balancing optimal spend with optimal risk to the best benefit of the organization. So by sorting out the implementation mechanisms for each function, the functions can be consistently and correctly executed. This keeps each management system healthy, which in turn ensures the entire program works as intended for optimal asset management outcomes. I don't want to read this slide to you, but I do want to take us through the implementation mechanisms just one more little scoop deeper and talk about the elements that are involved with implementation. These processes have methods and execution steps. The methodology is the way that the processes within a function are arranged. For example, in RE1, asset identification that we were talking about, there were 4 processes, which were asset decision matrix, deciding what's an asset organization, asset data documentation, and asset prioritization. So those processes together describe the methodology, the order in which things will be done for the function of asset identification. First, we decide what is an asset in our program. Then we decide how the assets will be organized in a hierarchy. Then we fully document each asset. And then we prioritize the assets relative to the risk presented to the business if the asset fails. How each process is performed is the execution part of the process, the specific actions that are taken to decide if something is an asset, for example. Then the people that are involved with the process or with the function must be informed about the AMP and their role in it. And then these people need to be trained to execute the processes for which they are responsible. Then the data sources and the output and input destinations and format must be fully described and tested for operability to make sure that the function can work. And finally, the health of each function needs to be measured against expectations. And usually this happens by collecting and analyzing and acting on the data that is related to the processes which are identified in the implementation mechanism. So that's the deeper dive on this. And this is why it's important to understand that it's not just about writing down 96 processes. You actually have to put them into play and keep them alive and make sure they work. That's how AMP is designed, and that's what it does. The final AMP framework topic is the roadmap. The AMP roadmap that we're going to talk about next is a method of organizing the asset management program functions to provide a visual reference for identifying the order in which the asset management functions are developed, implemented, and executed. And it's a way to indicate, as we'll see, the status or health of each function during the asset management program assessment, implementation and remediation. Earlier, I said that asset management is about balancing resources with risk. In other words, about spending the right amount of money to achieve the desired performance from your assets at the least risk to the business. When we talk about resources, we're talking about things that are common to any organization. The cost and effort of management, asset care execution, the cost of maintenance and materials, the cost of contracted services, and the cost of the software and other technology that supports asset management. So this graphic is what we're going to use to illustrate this concept. We're going to use it to represent the input that needs to be processed within the asset management program during the next few slides. And this graphic represents the risk scale that represents the output of the asset management program. The risk categories represent how the AMP processes are influencing risk to the organization. The less effective the AMP processes are being used or implemented or developed, the higher the risk. Remember, we're trying to achieve the least risk feasible relative to the resources that we have available to use. Asset management is not static. You don't just make the 96 processes and then walk away. There's a point to all of this. The function processes are what makes the asset management program go. By processing the inputs and creating output that provides an optimal balance of risk relative to resource input. What we want to accomplish is to spend an optimal amount of money on asset management. By optimal, I mean we get the best asset value for what we spend, usually expressed in terms of uptime. We don't want to waste money on things that don't matter, and at the same time, we don't want to miss taking care of things that could disrupt the business if it failed. This is what the processes are designed to do. If you look on the left, the general inputs into the asset management program are shown on the slide as management labor, execution labor, material, service, and software. These inputs feed into the appropriate management systems where they're addressed by each function within the management system by applying the function implementation mechanisms of process, people, data, and sustainability. Whether the spend for any input category is too high or too low, the processes and the implementation mechanisms optimize the spend by clarifying exactly what should be done and who should be doing each thing. The data necessary to execute each process is defined, as is the action required by each person responsible for executing the function processes. Well, that's all fine, but how can we know if what we're spending on the inputs is high or low? What's optimal? We must have a goal based on best practice. In asset management, the optimal spend by an organization on asset management is 2% to 4% of the replacement value of the asset. That's the best bang for the buck and simply represents the point at which annual maintenance costs for an asset are the most effective relative to the cost of replacing the asset. This is called the E1 performance indicator. As an example, if an asset cost $100,000, then we would expect to spend between $2,000 and $4,000 per year taking care of the asset. Simple as that. Let's apply this thinking to some asset management program scenarios. This slide represents the inputs we saw previously, the management systems that process the input, and the output in terms of risk to the business. This slide represents how we typically think about asset management with a medium risk. Each management system processes some input and has the people, processes, data, and sustainability it uses for its own purposes. Each management system tank is pretty much self-contained, and the people working in each management system don't necessarily know or care what's going on in the other tanks. The management systems are shown in the general order of implementation when starting up a program. Each system is usually managed by a specific department within the business, and while that design may appear to be effective, it actually is siloed with limited connectivity between the tanks. In this example, we can see that spend is on the bottom edge of the optimal band, which drives the risk output to medium. It's assumed by each management system tank personnel that the people working in the other tanks know what they're doing. The governance functions examine available resources and requirements and sends plans for asset acquisition to the lifecycle tank for processing into projects. Lifecycle tank outputs to the reliability tank, which processes the new assets so they can be properly cared for, and hands that output to the spare part tank. Processing there about what to stock and where to stock occurs, and the task care information is passed to work management for processing and on to calibration. Everyone assumes things are under control in each tank, and we're all doing the best job we can. We understand there's room for improvement, but as long as the processes within each tank are functional, we figure that we're providing a decent risk model for the business. Based on the over 200 asset management program gap analyses performed by Triad, here's the real picture. Spend is excessive. Optimal value isn't being returned by asset management processes, and the resultant risk to the business is high. This is because some elements necessary to effectively operate the management systems are missing. Some management systems are lacking process. Others don't have assigned people or roles and responsibilities for their people. Data isn't well defined, and the metrics and standards necessary to measure performance are missing. It's hard to tell what's going on between the high spend and the high risk, but something's wrong. We want to lower both spend and risk. To do that, we have to make sure that we're developing, implementing, and executing all of the processes correctly. If we only had a way to understand what should be going on in each tank and evaluate whether performance of the tank was optimal or not. Well, knowing what's going on in each tank is the entire point of the granularity and organization of the AMP framework. As you can see in this slide, using the AMP functions and integrating them into a single process removes the silo effect and makes each management system dependent on the others to return optimal risk to the business using optimal spend. This is what AMP does. All of the many moving parts, roles and responsibilities, data input and output, and sustainability are made manageable by reducing individual footprints and leveraging understanding of the asset management program intent. Having granularity and defined interfaces between the functions gives us the capability to assess what's going on in each function. Now each function can be assessed in terms of the process, people, data, and sustainability within it, and the pain points inside the function can be identified. In this way, the roadmap is used to indicate the status or health of each function. Since the functions are sorted into a timeline on the roadmap for implementation, the organization can clearly see which functions should be worked on first based on the risk and the timeline position of each function on the roadmap. The status of each function can also then be rolled up to indicate the health of each management system, as well as the overall health of the asset management program. This represents a potential for huge savings before even starting to change the way things are done. By defining necessary focus and timing, false starts and haphazard organization of the asset management program implementation effort are eliminated. By assessing existing practices in this way, the organization can most effectively take specific action to improve the spend and resource allocation and optimize risk to the business. Here's another way to look at the process flow between AMP functions, starting at the top left with governance function G01, leadership support. The governance functions continue, preparing the way for LC1, asset acquisition. Like I said before, this is a representation for clarity. In practice, there can be some overlap in developing the functions. This slide is really included as a ready reference in the guidebook for this course, but there's two main points I'd like to leave you with here. First, the AMP framework begins and ends with governance. Just like preparing soil for planting, preparing a foundation of leadership to guide development and implementation of the functions increases the likelihood of a good outcome. Here, that outcome is shown as an asset management program that is compliant with ISO 55000 guidelines, as shown at the top right at the end of the process flow. The second point is that there aren't any workarounds. Asset management is about process flow, and if any one of the processes within any of the functions is not optimal, then neither will be the program. Every process in every function contributes to the whole. This concludes the Introduction to Asset Management Program Overview training. I really hope you've benefited from the content and are better equipped to undertake your role in executing the functions that are associated with it. Thank you very much for your time.